Thank you so much, Trina, and thanks to everybody. It's so great to see so many people on here, some familiar faces as well. I'm Krista Norris. For those of you that I don't know, I've been at IU for 15 years. The majority of my time was spent at IUPUI until a couple of last 2 years I took on a new role. I've held multiple roles during my time at IU, but most of them have had a fairly common thread amongst all of them, which is the scholarship of community engagement, specifically as it relates to assessment. And that could have been assessment of student civic learning, institutional assessment related to our strategic plan, assessment of community impacts, and a very deep interest that I share with our guest speaker today, which is how faculty are recognized and rewarded through the promotion and tenure process for their engaged scholarship. I have the great honor of introducing you all to someone whom I consider not only to be a colleague, but a very great friend and a thought partner in my life. I hope that everyone on this call is fortunate enough to have someone like Lauren in their life, particularly a work wife, maybe. We share a very deep appreciation for it and are committed to improving higher education by studying how the things that we do, such as research, teaching, and service, contribute to the greater good, and by calling attention to areas where we see opportunities for improvement, and most often as it relates to the institutionalization of community engagement. Dr. Lauren Wendling serves as the Director of Institutional Success at Collaboratory, where she works with institutions to leverage data to move the needle on issues important to their campuses and communities. She earned her PhD from the same program as I in higher education administration from Indiana University, Bloomington, with a focus on urban education. And so I will stop talking so that we can listen to this special person today in the room. Please welcome Dr. Lauren Wendling.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Kristen, for the wonderful introduction and all of the wonderful things you said about me. Right back to you. I would absolutely not be here where I am today without your guidance and without randomly meeting you for coffee one time about 6 years ago. So just really thankful for everyone in the room. I'm gonna share my screen. So like was said up top, I'll share here for about 20-25 minutes. Just kind of, oh wait, I always hit the wrong button here. I want this one. Sharing about my dissertation and the work that I have had my thoughts wrapped around for the last couple of years. So this is, it's a, what I like to think is a polished, straightforward presentation, right? Keeping it to time. I want it to look polished. I want it to look like I know what I'm talking about. But for any grad student in the room or anyone considering grad studies and anyone who's gone through this process, you all know, and I want to just articulate, like the process of getting here has been ups and downs, lots of writing, rewriting, reading, rereading. So hopefully as good as this looks today, it's taken a long time to get here. And just again, want to thank all of those in my life who have helped me get here. But I'll, like I said, share just a little bit about my work and where my head has been. So my dissertation focuses on the larger question that you see here: how do school and department level promotion and tenure committees evaluate faculty's engaged research? So that was my big leading question. And one that, you know, a lot of sub questions have been built out of it, but this is what I ultimately wanted to figure out with my dissertation. So big question is, how did I get here? A lot of questions rolling through my mind, right, as you're trying to prepare a dissertation and prepare it in order to get it done, because I've always been told the best dissertation is a done dissertation, as I'm sure we've all heard. So wanting it to be nuanced enough and specific enough, but also open enough for value to come out of it for different institutions, faculty and staff, and even community partners. So how did I get to that question? Again, long road, but I credit it to the work that I did alongside my dissertation studies. So like Kristen and others have shared, I have been for the last 7 or 8 years that I've been in higher ed at IUPUI and then now at Collaboratory. So these are the two other like day jobs, literally, that kind of went alongside me as I completed my dissertation and my coursework. So I was at IUPUI for about 3 years as Kristen's grad assistant in the Office of Community Engagement when I did most of my coursework. And that's really when I was exposed to all things higher ed community engagement. And to have such a wonderful mentor as Kristen really spurred in me thinking about how do institutions, how do faculty and staff, how do we as a field improve and deepen partnerships? How do we do that from the institution side? How do we do that from the community side? And then that ultimately led me into thinking about it from the reward and recognition of faculty. So those questions were kind of percolating at IUPUI as I moved into Collaboratory and work with institutions across the country and the Kristen Norrises of every institution who are thinking really deeply about this type of work. Just continuously heard conversations around or frustrations or tension points around faculty who do really wonderful, phenomenal, engaged research, but aren't credited for it in their promotion and tenure. So this all kind of started percolating when I was at IUPUI, when I did a institutional study with Kristen, where we interviewed or chatted with over 70 engaged faculty at IUPUI specifically about their engaged work and engaged research. And out of those conversations, take away 3 big kind of points that led me to my dissertation question. So hearing across the institution from faculty in various departments and disciplines that oftentimes the institution or at the institutional level, there is this praising of engagement. There's this understanding or identification as being an engaged institution, but on the grounds, when push comes to shove, engaged faculty didn't feel like they were being rewarded in PNT. So those languages or the discussions that were being had were different in practice and then in the ideal. And then that obviously led to frustration. They felt, faculty were frustrated with how their research was, or more likely not being evaluated in their PNT packet, specifically at the school and department levels. And that ultimately led to just, again, more frustration and confusion when IUPUI and other campuses are being touted as highly engaged, but yet really struggle to, again, reward and retain engaged faculty. So those were a lot of the things that kind of just not forced me, but encouraged me to pursue this as a topic for my dissertation. So what does any good student do? You dive into the literature when you kind of have an idea of, well, this is where I want to go. I want to explore this, or I want to pull this thread more because there's so much tension around it. So in my, reading and digesting of everything that I could get my hands on as it comes to engaged research in PNT, broke it out into kind of looking through the literature through the lens of a faculty and then individual faculty, and then through the lens of institutions. So high level here, you see that the faculty that are engaged or that typically tend to do engaged research are primarily female, are primarily non-white, and are usually mid to late career post PNT, right? So that, inherently points to big red flags. This is an issue of equity, right? If we're not rewarding and engaging these specific types of faculty that choose to employ their resources and expertise in this way, that's an issue. And then when you look at it from the institution side, institutions that tend to be more engaged or adopt an engaged mission are those that are usually emphasizing teaching over research. So usually aren't your big R1 institutions. They tend to enroll students more from the local communities, and then are usually situated in areas where there are more significant social and economical challenges, which tend to be urban campuses. So I will also looking at the literature through just the lens of institutionalization of community engagement and what does that look like. So we tend to see, or the field tends to see, right, that the institutionalization of engagement typically tends to happen from a top-down perspective, although much literature has said, as was kind of continuously pointed out to me in my conversation with faculty at IUPUI, that the most immediate effects of this institutionalization or lack of institutionalization are felt at the school and department levels. So while institutions might have wonderful, public websites or wonderful institution level guidelines rewarding peer engaged research, if that doesn't trickle down to the school and department levels, it kind of feels all for naught. And then I feel like I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but wanted to throw these on the slide too, that engaged research and its corresponding scholarship are often misunderstood and incorrectly categorized as service as opposed to research, so which adds to the nuance and issues with it being appropriately evaluated. And then again, as we all pretty much know, most in P&T, when engaged faculty are being evaluated, it is their peer-reviewed journal articles that are often take priority or precedence over any type of locally disseminated work. So again, those are some of the sticky, icky points. And I just kept coming back to the thread that I feel like I heard across many faculty members, across other like qualitative studies that I had read, that no one on my committees understand or know what community engagement is. So that led me to think about, what does this evaluation of engaged research look like specifically at the school and department levels as opposed to an institution level? So for total research questions, I'm only gonna share 2 here because want to kind of narrow the focus in 20 minutes. But like I shared earlier, big broad question is, how do school and department level promotion and tenure committees, how do they evaluate faculty's engaged research? And what I essentially meant by that is, what guidelines are they using? Do they use any tools? What are they talking about? Like, what is leading or guiding the evaluation? Because that seems to be kind of behind closed doors. If you're not a faculty member, which I obviously wasn't and I'm not now, you're not in part of those conversations. So a lot of that was because there seemed to be an air of mystery. I also am kind of nosy and just wanted to know more about that. So that was my leading question. And then building from that, really dug into, in this evaluation of engaged research, are committee members and evaluators differentiating the processes and the products of engaged research? So do they differentiate? And if so, how do they? And I'll share this, this graphic. This is something that adapted from Hartward, Callison, and Wallace, and shared this with the faculty that I spoke with as part of my data collection and interviews, which I'll get into in a second, but wanted to really clearly articulate how traditional research is differentiated from community engaged research in terms of the processes, which you see in those first 4 rows, and then the products. So when traditional or engaged research is being evaluated in promotion and tenure, are the processes of that research, are they being evaluated? Are the committee members thinking of, how did you come to these research questions or these goals? How was your study designed? Is it a quality study design? How was the data interpreted? How was it analyzed? Or are they focusing primarily on the outcomes or the products of that research, engaged or traditional? So I'll share a little bit about how I went about collecting and analyzing the data. This is never my favorite part of any presentation, so I'm going to kind of go quickly through it, but happy to talk more about it after. So what I ultimately did was a multi-site single case study. So I looked at 5 R1 institutions, all of whom had received the Carnegie Elective Community Engagement classification in the spring of 2020, and chose that to initially bound my study because I wanted to look solely at R1 institutions, because again, that's where most of the tension is. Institutions that are doing and touting and promoting a lot of research and research product. But again, those would be from prior research known to be the ones less likely to adopt an engaged mission. But those that narrowed my focus even more to looking at those that were recently classified, because in my mind, and in the as I think others would agree, if you receive that classification, you are at least on the forefront of being an engaged institution. So started there, and those institutions, once they were kind of whittled down a bit, I reached out to the community engagement professionals that either I or Kristen had a relationship with to source participants for interviews. So I ended up talking to 12 tenured, engaged faculty members who have experience either currently serving or previously serving on their school and or department review committee. So I talked to them for at least 60 minutes, usually longer than that. And I'll throw this up here just because I feel like people always ask for it. There's just some characteristics of the institutions that were a part of my study. So they are diverse in terms of public or private, area of the country, kind of the community or area in which they're situated. Happy to talk more about this, and I will share slides afterwards, so please don't feel like you need to pour through this now. But did just want to kind of share what the institutions look like in terms of big, broad characteristics. So to analyze the data, transcribed all of the interviews, which I realized Zoom does for free, which was awesome and a huge time saver, because I should say I initially envisioned the study to be a focus group, or to be multiple focus groups to get faculty talking together from different disciplines and different areas of institutions. But then COVID happened, so couldn't do that. So switched into Zoom interviews. So transcribed all the interviews through Zoom, explored the data just big and broad, did a lot of memoing, and then coded it in a more open fashion to develop some raw codes, did some more axial coding, sent out my initial findings to my interviewees, which was fantastic. Really didn't expect to get a lot back in terms of the member checks, but got some really great advice and thought and critique. And then did some more selective coding, and then examined my ultimate findings in light of current literature. So I'm gonna share with you 4 big findings, or the 4 biggest findings that I at least would qualify as the biggest from my study. So you'll see those are the ones here on the big red slides. So if you take anything away, I would remember these 4 slides. The first one, which again, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here, but schools, departments, and their review committees do not have an agreed upon definition of engaged research or engaged scholarship. And that significantly hinders their ability to effectively evaluate it. And I'll clarify this a bit because I think almost every institution in my study had an institution level definition of community engagement or community engaged scholarship, or some type of reference to it in their institution level promotion and tenure guidelines. But that did not trickle down to the school and department level. So there was a big gap between, well, our institution thinks of it this way, but our school and department don't think about it at all. I've interspersed some quotes in here from participants, which I'll just read aloud because I always find it difficult when someone's talking and I'm trying to read a quote. So one participant said that, I think that my department, with some individual exceptions, the department and the school don't really have a conception of community engaged scholarship, to the extent that they either don't know anything about it, they don't like it, they think it's useless. So it doesn't really matter if they have an accurate understanding of it. So some school and department level review committees just entirely balk even at the institution level definition of engagement. So that kind of caused me to pause and to say, well, is it that the school and departments aren't, the school and department review committees aren't recognizing the institution level definition of engagement? Are they true in thinking that it's not in their guidelines? Are they confused about it? So I dug into the institution level guidelines of each institution in my study, 4 of which were publicly available, and essentially just did like a big kind of analysis of how the frequency of engaged terminology in their guidelines, and then where that terminology lies. And each institution had some reference to engagement, some more than others, but across the board, it was fairly low in terms of engagement or engaged scholarship being present in their institutional guidelines. So I pulled out, just a few quotes from the institution level guidelines, where they defined community engagement as useful contributions to an academic unit, the university, or a civic organization. And then one institution level guideline specifically said that it's going to be really hard to get tenure on a rating of service or engagement. It's super rare. So kind of even calling it out in their institution level guidelines. So that led me to second big finding, that the current school and department level guidelines are far too rigid, and they are not inclusive of non-traditional forms of research and scholarship. Because of their rigidity, then committees are then unable to from like the very beginning to appropriately categorize engaged scholarship as research. So if they can't call it research, they can't evaluate it as research. So there's kind of two sides to this coin here. I think when engaged faculty would bring their engaged research into P&T, it often, as we know in the literature is shown, it gets kind of funneled into that service bucket or service category, which is the first battle. But should it be attempted to be put into the research category, it's just kind of not possible in a lot of ways. So because faculty can't even initially define their engaged research as research, it can't be evaluated as research, and they either have to go up on service, or as we see many do, they do their community engaged research and then they do to their traditional research to fulfill that research quota. So again, another quote that is kind of disheartening, but I think again speaks to what I heard from a lot of my participants, that a community-based dissemination of a research project just doesn't count. It would be counted as service, but if it is not from a peer-reviewed publication, it's automatically seen as second tier, and it's just not scholarship. So that's the first hurdle to overcome, is just having engaged research be categorized or understood as research in and of itself. So that also led me back to the guideline analysis to think, well, if I did this big frequency or understanding of where engagement or how frequent engagement terminology is in the guidelines, second question is, where is it present? Is it more present in the teaching section of, the institutional level guidelines? Is it more in the research or service? So you'll see here that it's kind of divided, again, smaller sample, but the brunt of engagement terminology was in the research and service section. So that is a bit curious for some of the institutions where it is more prevalent in the research section, but still across the board, engaged scholarship of the institutions to whom I spoke, you just can't classify it as research. So that led me to the third finding that kind of bounces off the second one. So the second one, or the second finding, essentially points to like not being able to call it research. For those that might be able to squeak through and call their engaged research, the current metrics used to evaluate traditional scholarship or traditional research are totally inappropriate to evaluate engaged scholarship. And for those faculty that could get their engaged research classified or categorized as research, even then the committees that are evaluating it were set to a very strict evaluative criteria. So they had to evaluate a faculty's engaged research against traditional metrics. And that ultimately led it to just being unable to be effectively assessed. So going back to the separation or differentiation of processes and products, no one is evaluating process, not at all. It's entirely built or entirely evaluated on the products of traditional or engaged research. And that's, I think, true detriment to those specifically who do engaged research, because as I'm sure many of you are engaged researchers and clearly know the time, the effort, the person power that you have to put into developing relationships, to ensuring that community voice is heard, that community members are brought into your research projects, is so much more time intensive. And that is just, again, kind of just wiped across the board, where they're only looking at the products of your research, be it traditional or engaged. So if there's one thing at all that you take away from this, and I highlight, this is the one animation I built into my slide because it's so important. If you take away one thing, it's just the processes of engaged research are not the same as traditional research. The products of engaged research are not the same as traditional research. So the metrics to evaluate them cannot be the same. You cannot hold community engaged research against traditional research metrics and expect that to fix the problem. So with the first problem being just classifying or categorizing engaged scholarship as research, that's the first battle. The second one, which I think is a much harder hill to climb, is how to effectively evaluate it through metrics that are responsive to engaged research. So the most commonly cited metrics of research just across the board from every single person that reviewer that I spoke with, you see those 5 here, like how many peer-reviewed publications does the faculty member have? What are their journal impact factors? What national funding are they receiving? What is their national reputation as an academic scholar? and then what are their peers from other academic institutions saying about them. And these are the metrics that are held against any type of research, again, be it traditional or engaged. So I'll share this quote because this is out of any conversation I had with the faculty that I interviewed, this is the one that hit home the most when we think about the metrics that are being evaluated or evaluated against. A professor spoke about a peer in his department who does all the things that he's supposed to do. He has a YouTube channel that reaches, he said, almost 8 million people across the globe, or excuse me, across the country. But when they looked at his, dossier, everyone said, well, that just counts for nothing because it's neat, but who cares? How many journal articles does he have? And that to me was just so crushing. Not just doing the engaged research, but putting it out or disseminating it in a way that reaches so many people just counts for nothing because, again, they're held to those traditional metrics and standards. So the last finding that I'll share before kind of getting into the recommendations and kind of launching into this discussion. When asking those, again, that have served on committees, how do you evaluate your peers' engaged research? Because it's a different type of research, do you use different tools? Do you have different metrics or guidelines, or how do you do it? And across the board, there were no institution-specific supports to assist the committees evaluate engaged research. So not even definitions, not any different type of criteria. Again, it was just evaluated as you would any type of research. And then building on top of that quickly learned that no external resources were utilized at any of those institutions. And there aren't a lot of external resources. I will point to three that I specifically brought up to all of my participants, and I'll use this time to highlight Purdue University put together their guide that has a lot of really rich information about how not just do you document your engaged scholarship, but how do you evaluate it. So that huge resource that I would suggest. IUPUI has put together criteria for evaluating what they identify as public scholarship. And then I'll also point to Community Engaged Scholarship for Health that has, again, some more metrics and thinking around how can you effectively evaluate engaged scholarship more through the health or public health lens. But three wonderful resources that just no one is either knows about or is utilizing. So all of those conversations, really frustrating to have, and I could feel or I could hear the frustrations in the voices of the folks that I interviewed, digested all of that, sat with it for a lot, and I have 2 slides to share with you before I wrap up about my personal recommendations about if Lauren was in charge of higher education, what would Lauren do to change things? Just through this very little narrow specific lens. So outlined it in a way that I wanted to be visual but also hopefully clean cut enough. 4 simple steps, you solve the problem, which I obviously know it's not that simple. But across the institutions that were a part of my study and the faculty that I spoke with, across the folks that I have developed relationships with and have learned so much from in my work with Collaboratory, I see a lot of institutions in varying stages of this kind of stair step. So the first step, I think, to appropriately institutionalize community engagement. And when I say institutionalize, I very much mean it's built into promotion and tenure, and faculty are rewarded for that. The first step is just you got to want to do it. And probably the easiest step for everyone on this call, but you have to get others to care about it too. You have to generate that buy-in. And at least with the institutions that I've spoken with during 2020, the summer of 2020 is when I conducted my interviews. And they were all there. A lot of it was charged by, recent events, COVID, Black Lives Matter, like more of a reckoning of like our scholarship and our faculty need to be more dedicated to community. More vocal faculty, a lot of institutions kind of reworking or re-identifying or, reconceptualizing their mission and strategic plans. So the first step, you got to have a desire to do it. From there, I think you build into additional supports created through the university, and we oftentimes see that as more centralization of engagement. So the creation of centers, offices, committees, where I feel like a lot of institutions are also there, but maybe need to revisit step 1 a bit. Third step, kind of what you saw in my first couple of findings, the guidelines need to be revised in order to better define engagement and to open the definitions of research and scholarship. So taking a broader understanding or conceptualization of what research and scholarship mean, better defining community engagement. And a lot of institutions are there. And I think that is not the final step at all. And doing so at the institution level, but then also doing the really hard work and revising those guidelines at the school and department level is a big endeavor. Like that's a 10+ year, chunk of work. And I do not say that lightly. But I think the fourth, and I don't want to say final because I'm sure there's more, but what I see at the top of that stair step is after you have, or in conjunction with guideline revisions, you have to think about the creation or again, reconceptualization of metrics to evaluate engaged scholarship. Because if it's defined, if it's touted in your guidelines, that's one thing. But again, if you hold it to the same metrics that time and time again, faculty are being evaluated against for their traditional scholarship, the guideline revisions, I think, I don't want to say are worthless, but just don't hold as much weight. So how do you do that? And by no means have the right recipe for this, but I'll leave this slide up just as I close, identifying again those 5 traditional metrics, which again, across the board, every institution was tracking or was evaluating their engaged faculty against. You need to adjust those metrics, at least initially, to think about how you could adjust them to better evaluate engaged scholarship. So expanding the notion of what counts as evidence of scholarship. So looking at different types of outputs or outcomes outside of peer-reviewed journal articles, and I list some there that could be understood as valuable. I think you have to reconceptualize funding. So recognizing not just national funding from NES or NFS or NSF or other large organizations, but really paying attention to and recognizing local funding. Same thing with reputation. You can't just look at a national or scholar's national reputation. I think really hearing the voices of their local or regional or state community members and their partner organizations is crucial. How are they being understood, touted? How are they working in or with their communities, and what do their communities ultimately think of them? Expanding the notion of impact. So again, beyond journal impact factors. So thinking about the depth of the partnerships that they have established with the community, how their scholarship and their scholarly products have impacted community through possible like new programs that were created or policy that was written. If you need to get into the nitty-gritty of numbers and beans, how many community members have been impacted? And then lastly, thinking again about valuing the voice of community partners in this whole evaluative process. So if you're asking or requesting external letters from colleagues and peers, those colleagues and peers also need to be community members or folks in the community that are working alongside these engaged researchers that can speak to the merits or detriments of their engaged scholarship. So I feel like I've talked a whole lot, and I know that I'm over time. So I'll pause here. I'm happy to flip back to other slides, but we'll get right into the discussion because I know I've got about 20 minutes of that. So I'll pass it back to our moderators.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Lauren. And yes, we've had some good questions coming up in the chat, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and some, I think, thought-provoking questions and recommendations that have come out of it. And so I'm wondering if we might just jump into a couple questions that came up in the chat just to start off. Kristen, would you like to go ahead and maybe pick one?
Yeah, I was curious. I don't know which of these questions. There's so many in there that I think are really great. I do want you to clarify though, Lauren. I think this is in your methodology, and I know the answer to this. You really did focus on community engaged research. Mm-hmm. But I think there were a lot of questions that, and maybe you could speak to other research from your literature review. Speak to the interest in scholarship of teaching and learning, and has that muddy in service learning, has that made it better or worse to understanding community engaged research as research? Because your study really did focus on the scholarship of community engaged research, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Could you just, there was questions in here about teaching a little
Yeah.
bit.
Oh, okay.
Like, so for example, if there are now peer-reviewed journals, right, that look at specifically teaching and learning or community engagement. And so, like, for example, one of the questions is, I think, more around how are those viewed when it comes to
Oh,
P&T,
Mhm.
just as an example, just to
got
get
it.
you started.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I mean, Kristen, you're right. My focus and conversation was around the products of engaged research. So not necessarily teaching, but I recognize that oftentimes a lot of products of engaged scholarship or engaged teaching are journal articles or things like that. So while this wasn't a pointed question that I chatted with, because it was again through the research lens, if it was like, if the scholarship that came out of your engaged teaching was published in a peer-reviewed journal article that had a high impact factor, you're good across the board. Which I know too, like a lot of engaged journals, and I can't speak entirely for engaged teaching journals. That's not, I'm not entirely familiar with those, but the impact factors for engaged journals are often much lower than those of traditional research journals. Or so that was another struggle, that oftentimes if faculty are publishing in journals that have a lower impact factor, that, and these are not my words, but the quality might be lesser because the impact factor is lesser. So committees would often want more of those, so more quantity over quality. If you had, it would be, and I'm just throwing numbers here, but like it would be better to have 10 articles at a lower journal impact factor as opposed to like 3 or 4 in journals that had a very high impact factor. So that's
And it was also very intentional when we talked about your study and your methodology. You were really, really focused on research, specifically community engaged research. And it's one of the reasons you chose to do R1 institutions.
Yeah.
It was, I think a lot of the literature we had discussed and thought about was looking at faculty promotion tenure, broadly speaking.
Mhm.
But one of the gaps, I think, in the literature was that we really needed to look at the faculty who are doing research and the scholarship associated with that. And I would just say, for those of you who are thinking about like citations or future research, I think Lauren was trying to address a bigger gap that refining. There's a lot of research, right, that had been done on faculty promotion, tenure, and faculty's engaged scholars, and wanted to really hone in on that one aspect. And so I think you focused on the research side of it for that reason.
Yeah, definitely did, because again, I felt the need to narrow, right? You have to have a super narrow dissertation, but I mean, the literature does by and large say that it is bigger R1 research institutions that struggle to institutionalize their engagement more than anything else. So like smaller liberal arts, teaching colleges, things like that, it's easier, by no means is easy, but easier to do that. So I went down that lens just because there was far more tension there. So if you're a teaching faculty at an R1, I think you have a different path for sure, but depending on, I mean, it's also so heavily disciplinary or department based that if you find yourself in a department or school that is more, I don't want to say comfortable with, but more appreciates the teaching component of your work, then you're likely having an easier path as opposed to being in like a hard science. And that was something else that, and I didn't explain this in my methodology, at least here, but in my sample of faculty that I spoke with ensured that I drew from faculty across the board. So some who were in like very heavy STEM fields, some that were in more social science fields. And with, again, through the lens of research, this tension and pain point were there throughout any disciplinary lens, but teaching might have been a different story for like social sciences or things like that.
Lauren, John had a question in the chat too, basically referring to the fact that we see a larger percentage of junior faculty, pre-tenure faculty doing more community engaged research. Would you agree? Like, how's that aligning with your findings? Your initial finding is that the literature says it mostly happens for faculty who already have tenure, but we see a growing trend, right? You agreed?
Yeah, absolutely. And those that I spoke with definitely see that. The faculty that I speak with now, I mean, outside of any research, I see that for sure. I think it's trending in a different direction. I think grad programs are not across the board, but are becoming much more amenable to doing more engaged or participatory based research. I will say that, and this rang more true for like the STEM or harder science faculty that I spoke with. Many of them said that they would see junior faculty maybe wanting to take this type of approach, but they either themselves or folks in their department would heavily advise them not to until they completed tenure, because they're already on a tenure track at their big R1 institution. So I can't say this definitively, right? It's not super generalizable, but my gut kind of says that when students are graduating and taking pre-tenure roles at institutions, specifically at R1s, and they're all gung-ho to do engaged research, it's very quickly kind of shut down if they're in a larger R1 institution and saying this is something that we do after tenure. I had multiple people tell me that, like, I advise my junior faculty to not do engaged research until they get PNT. And we heard that a lot at IUPUI too, right? And that's like the benefit or the bonus that they get to do after they get tenure. So I think that more students are coming out of their programs ready to do it, but I just don't know if the institutions are ready to accept it yet, at least larger R1s.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Kristen.
I was just going to say, Lauren, I think that your dissertation doesn't address this one question that's come up in the chat about nomenclature. They're specifically looking at the difference between, do you call it community engagement, community-based research, community engaged research, scholarship of engagement? And this is something I know we ran into in some studies we did prior to your dissertation. I would love your why is is this good, bad, the nomenclature, and choosing terminology and defining it. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and if I could jump in, because you talk about this, right? Like the idea of definitions and like terms in your dissertation. So I'd love to hear a little more about that too. And I think the audience would.
Yeah, that was, if I remember correctly, that was like question number one after, hi, I'm Lauren, thanks for chatting. What do you call it? How do you define it? How do you or your school define it? And across the board, I mean, it was a lot of different definitions: engaged research, engaged scholarship, public scholarship, all the things. And so I just kind of use community engagement or community engaged research as that larger umbrella. It's like, not that I don't care what you call it, but I don't want to get hung up on definitions. So would use their terminology, at least as I was speaking to them. And again, and I wrote about this in my final product, right, about how I kind of all consume that up under engaged research, just for clarity within my writing. But I see this, I mean, any institution you talk to, any individual you talk to, like, define and, call it oftentimes different things. And I think this is my personal feelings, that I think sometimes as a field, we get too hung up on defining or trying to create one definition that is across the board. This is what everyone should buy into. I think ultimately we're working towards the same goal. We have the same understandings of what quality engaged research is and should be. I don't think it necessarily matters what we call it. It will matter what you call it in your guidelines and how you reference it in your dossier and in your packet. You have to obviously align those. But I think as a field, we don't need to spend the next 5 years trying to define it and getting every institution and practitioner to accept that definition. We just need to be okay with, I think, we're working towards the same goal. We're calling it something different, but we need to move the needle on appropriately recognizing it and rewarding it. So definitions clearly fall in there. And that was a point where a lot of the folks that I spoke with kind of got hung up on too sometimes. But after we just, okay, this is what you call it, and I recognize there's frustration around not everyone accepting that, let's move on. Yeah, that's just kind of a little frustration on my own too.
Yeah. There's another question in here that Farah's put up here. How to find meaningful metrics while also balancing that with what's feasible and realistic. And as much as we want it to be recognized as research, is there a need for us to, by categorizing it as research or valuing it as research, are we doing anything to the detriment of our teaching and our service buckets as well? So anyway, I think things around the feasibility of metrics. How do you change how community voice is represented? And how feasible is that?
Yeah, yeah. Not something you do in a year, not something you do in 5 years. And I know, Kristen, we've had conversations and thinking, like in my thinking of like, okay, I recommend these things. How do you actually do it? How does the rubber meet the road? And I'm really inspired by some institutions that that have started down this process in valuing engaged or in valuing partner voice by creating, so like University of Minnesota comes to mind, right, where they have a committee of faculty that evaluate engaged research, so a committee of engaged faculty who evaluate the dossiers of their engaged faculty members. When you think about bringing in community partner voice, I would think a similar model would be the easiest to adopt, at least initially. So having either an institution or a system level committee or group of individuals, or even someone across the field, like again, I know, Kristen, we've had conversations about this, that are experts or are knowledgeable about engaged research that could look at someone's dossier and reach out to their community partners to essentially vet the person going up, and just, you know, be it a survey or more of a phone call or something like that, but to rely on not the individual school or department level committee members to do that work, because they're often not engaged researchers, don't know how to do that, probably shouldn't be just let loose in community, right? But relying on, again, an institution or system level or even field level committee or group of scholars to evaluate it. And that's something that I think would be so exciting to put together and offer to institutions. That's where my mind goes, at least initially. I don't think it should be up to the individual school and department level committees.
Yes, Lauren and I have a dream world where we're going to like create a separate like unit that all universities, and all we do for the rest of our lives is interview community partners who are involved in community engaged work and evaluate them for promotion and tenure, to write letters of recommendation that come from the academy, you know, that are valued from the Academy of Community Voice, and to bring, I think, community voice back into perspective as we talk about how we gain trust of our institutions, how the community values higher education in general, much less of the research and the quality of our work, when we perpetually and historically have and continue to remove we do not see community. If you do not have a PhD and work in the ivory tower, your voice does not truly matter about what a faculty member does in an institution. Which is so contradictory to our mission statements and rhetorically what our institutions say. And anyways, I will also open this up to anybody else. Trina, I think there's like a bunch more messages that have come through in the chat that I
yeah, so we've got about 6 minutes left, so I wanted to make sure we try to address at least one more question from the chat. So Robert had sort of started to ask about, and maybe this is related to also Heather's question around professional organization guidelines. Did those come up at all in your research, in your dissertation study, as you were looking at maybe resources? But then Robert was saying, you know, having looked at lots of different standards documents recently, this idea of like the work or the proxies versus the actual work, right? So being published in an acceptable journal, right, as a proxy for the work actually being done. And so when thinking about evaluation, you know, is it appropriate to be asking committees to be, you know, evaluating in that way, right? Like looking at proxies. But so I think sort of there's these questions about how do we do this, yeah. Right? And so what are maybe some tools that you ran across in addition to the ones you already shared?
Yeah, I say nail on the head there, Robert, in terms of like evaluating or identifying proxies. I mean, that's from my experience and knowledge, all the committees are doing. I shouldn't say all the committees are doing, but what committees are doing. They are evaluating research based on those numbers or those beams. How many articles, how much money, like those are definitely proxies. And to the question of, do I think that committees should be evaluating in this way? Ideal world, not at all. I think that we should hold our committees and our other faculty colleagues accountable for, if you want your department, school, institution to truly value the work that it says that it does, I think you have to evaluate it in a different way. I think we need to be asking more of the committees. And I say that recognizing that, again, the majority of people on committees are not engaged researchers. So I think that's where it often can or should funnel up to a larger institution-wide committee. And I think that there are some metrics and beams that can be counted. I think you could still obviously consider a number of articles and things like that. But when you get into more nuanced type of work, I think you need to evaluate it more effectively, because I mean, they're just looking at numbers, and I don't think that they're doing enough. I mean, point blank, I think it's just, do they have these numbers? Can we pass them out the door? And that's frustrating. And I say that as someone who's also not been on a review committee and don't know the ins and outs entirely. But I think we have to look beyond proxies if we truly want to value and push forward the public work of institutions. Like, if we want to put our money where our mouth is, then we have to do it a different way. And does that get to the question? I feel like I'm just kind of evangelizing at this point. Read back through it. Oh, and other like metrics or other guides or things to be helpful in that evaluation. Right now, I'm remembering. No, pretty much no one really referenced any other like disciplinary or other types of resources. And when I shared the few that I knew of, they weren't known. When I didn't explicitly ask, well, I did explicitly ask, like, what do you use as rubrics or guidelines? And most everyone said, no, we just kind of do it by our gut and if they met their numbers. So I don't know of any that were referenced, at least within the folks that I chatted with. Yeah.
But perhaps collaborating with folks like Heather at ACLS or even folks at MLA seems like could be an area for progress, maybe. So I just quickly to address one last question. Yes, Mitch, slides will be shared, but we are kind of running to the end of our time for the moderated Q&A. So just a reminder, there is going to be another 30 minutes for like open discussion. But as we kind of wrap up this more moderated Q&A, I wanted to ask Lauren, what advice do you have for folks who are, especially graduate students, prospective or current graduate students? What advice do you have from your experience, from your dissertation process? What would you like to leave us with?
Yeah. Ooh, lots of stuff going through my mind, but I mean, the first thing that really comes to it that I would kind of hit home for me is whatever topic or question or area that you choose, make sure it's one that you enjoy talking about in depth. And I mean, obviously mine was more qualitative in nature and had so many conversations, but this energizes me to have these conversations. So find the tension points in the areas where you're working that you want to change and dive into those. And there might be a lot of them, or so it's a lot to choose from, but find where you're passionate in terms of like, what conversations are you having with people when you're not on the clock, or when, you're just, talking with colleagues or friends or partners, and this is what's grinding my gears today, and connect it. I mean, I think you can connect anything to academia. So read the literature, dive in, because you're going to be doing it for the next year or so. And then I would also say to find cheerleaders that can be on your team. Kristen is absolutely a cheerleader. So many people that I work with, parents, partners, friends, definitely cheerleaders. And I'll also say, like, my dissertation chair, who is not in this field and who's a wonderful, brilliant scholar, wasn't a subject matter expert. And he was my chair because he was my cheerleader. Didn't really fully understand or get the engaged stuff, but he got me through it. And I mean, roped Kristen into my committee because she is the subject matter expert. So just finding people who can be in your corner and who will talk about this with you ad nauseum.
Great, thank you so much. And this concludes our moderated Q&A portion. We are again going to have another 30 minutes for an opportunity for deeper discussion with Lauren, but we also understand if folks can't stay on. But as we're transitioning, a few reminders, because I know some folks have come on since we started. We are recording the webinar and it'll be available soon, both on the Lead California YouTube channel and in an email we'll send out to all registrants. That'll have a link to the slide deck, also the dissertation, the recording, and also some of the resources that were mentioned in the presentation. Also, as we wrap up, we have an evaluation that Piper is going to put a link to in the chat. So we'd love it if you could complete our evaluation and help us continue to improve these webinars. And then finally, we do have another dissertation dish that will be coming up on February 2nd at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. And that'll feature Dr. Jamie Ducar, who is the Executive Director of the Engaged Campus at the University of Pittsburgh. And her dissertation topic is organization development for an engaged campus, assessing narratives and architecture to direct future change. So we'll be sending out more details and a registration link to that as well. And at this point, we'll turn it back over to Lauren.